We've been talking about direct objects which receive the action of the verb. There's another type of object that a verb may have. It's called an indirect object. An indirect object is a noun or a pronoun that answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom after a transitive verb. An indirect object comes between the verb and the direct object in a sentence. The sentences we've been looking at so far under the heading of direct objects contain a subject, a transitive verb, and then a direct object which receives the action of the verb. Some sentences that contain transitive verbs also contain indirect objects. Not all, not even most, but some sentences will contain that indirect object as well. The indirect object tells us to whom or for whom the action has been done, and the indirect object actually appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. If this sounds a bit confusing, look at this example, which should make it all very clear. Andrea told her mother the good news. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is told. That tells us what was done. And who or what is the subject? Andrea. Andrea is the one who did the telling. Now, what's the direct object of the verb told? That is, what did Andrea tell? Andrea told what? She told the good news. The noun news specifically is the direct object. That's what Andrea told. However, we notice there's another noun, her mother. That phrase has been stuck in between the direct object and the verb. What role does her mother play? Her mother is the indirect object. That answers the question, to whom Andrea told the good news. So the direct object is news. That's what Andrea told. And her mother is the indirect object. That's the person to whom the news was told. So you notice that a specific type of transitive verb is necessary to make an indirect object make sense. A verb like tell is one that makes sense as having an indirect object, because it's the kind of verb where you would do the action to someone or for someone. You tell someone some news. That is, you tell the news to a particular person. So in this case, mother, that noun, is the indirect object of the transitive verb told. And notice that the indirect object has been placed in between the verb and the direct object. When you learn English, that's one of the things that you learn, perhaps unconsciously. Little children who are learning English at their mother's knee never learn this rule, that is, that an indirect object appears in such and such a place in the sentence, but somehow, just from hearing hundreds and thousands of English sentences, they come to understand that a noun or pronoun that's been placed in that location in a sentence is serving in that way. It's answering the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom, and therefore it's serving as the indirect object. Here's another sentence to illustrate how this works. Stuart bought Donna a bouquet of flowers. The verb is bought. The subject is Stuart. Stuart did the buying. And what did Stuart buy? That is, what's the direct object? He bought a bouquet, specifically a bouquet of flowers. But the noun bouquet is the direct object of the verb bought. Now, for whom or to whom did he buy the bouquet? Well, he bought the bouquet for Donna. And by simply inserting the word Donna there in between the verb and the direct object, we know that Donna is serving as the indirect object. Donna tells us for whom Stuart bought the bouquet. So Donna is the noun which serves as the indirect object in this sentence. Both of the examples we've looked at so far happen to use nouns as indirect objects, but a pronoun could be used equally well. So that, for example, that same sentence could read, Stuart bought her a bouquet of flowers. In this case, the pronoun her would substitute for Donna, and it would also act as the indirect object. An indirect object would always be a noun or a pronoun, but it could be either one. Notice that an indirect object is not the object of a preposition. We've said that the indirect object answers the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom. Each of those phrases, to what, to whom, for what, for whom, is in fact a prepositional phrase, because to and for are prepositions, and the noun or pronoun that follows them makes up, with the preposition, a prepositional phrase. However, when you actually use the prepositional phrase in a sentence, then you no longer have an indirect object, even though the meaning is exactly the same. Grammatically, it would be considered something different and would be treated differently grammatically. Let me illustrate what I mean. Look at this sentence. Ray told his little sister a story. The verb is told, the subject is Ray. The direct object, that is, what did Ray tell, is story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Answer, sister, his little sister more specifically. So sister is the indirect object, and it's placed just where it is supposed to be, between the verb and the direct object. Now, here's another sentence that says the same thing, but doesn't contain an indirect object. Ray told a story to his little sister. In this sentence, we have the same verb, told, and the same subject, Ray. We even have the same direct object, story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Well, he told his little sister. But in this case, little sister is not appearing as an indirect object. Notice that it's not placed between the verb and the direct object. Instead, it has been made part of a prepositional phrase and stuck on at the end of the sentence. To his little sister. The preposition to introduces the prepositional phrase. So even though the meaning is the same, in this case, the grammatical structure is different. The indirect object has been taken out of its proper place between the verb and the direct object and has been tacked on at the end with a prepositional phrase. Either construction is perfectly clear and either one is perfectly correct. We simply want to differentiate them so that you'll understand the difference between an indirect object and the object of a prepositional phrase. The meaning is the same, but grammatically they are different, and different rules would apply. Finally, an indirect object may be compound. Just as a direct object may include two or more things joined by a coordinating conjunction, the same can be true of an indirect object. Look at this sentence. Ms. Powell gave her mother and father a beautiful anniversary gift. What's the verb here? Gave. The subject, Ms. Powell. And what did Ms. Powell give? That is, what's the direct object? The answer, gift. She gave a gift, specifically a beautiful anniversary gift. Now, to whom did she give the gift? That is, what's the indirect object of the verb gave? The answer is mother and father. There are two indirect objects in this sentence because there are two people to whom the gift was given. Those two words, mother and father, joined by the coordinating conjunction and, go together to make up a compound indirect object in this sentence. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In this exercise, we gave you several sentences and asked you to decide for each one whether or not an indirect object appears. Let's take a look at them one by one. First, Moesha wrote her grandmother a long letter thanking her for the birthday gift. It's usually a good way to start to look for the verb in a sentence like this and then work from the verb outward. What's the verb in this sentence? The answer is wrote. Wrote is the word that contains the action of the sentence. And who or what is the subject? Who did the writing? The answer, Moesha. Now, is there a direct object? That is there something in the sentence which tells us what Moesha wrote? Something that receives the action of the verb wrote. Yes, what Moesha wrote was a letter, specifically a long letter. So the word letter is the direct object of the verb wrote. It tells us what Moesha wrote. Now the tricky question, is there an indirect object? That is there something in the sentence that tells us to what, to whom, or for whom the letter was written? Well, the letter was written to Moesha's grandmother, and that noun, grandmother, appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. Therefore, it's in the right place for an indirect object. And that, in fact, is what it is. So the noun grandmother is the indirect object here. It answers the question, to whom Moesha wrote the letter. And that's the answer for this first question. Next, after 2 days of debate, the town council awarded the road maintenance contract to a company owned by several local citizens. It's a long, complicated sentence, but let's break it down piece by piece, and I think you'll find it's not that difficult to understand. First, what's the verb? What's the action that's happening in this sentence? The answer is awarded. Who or what is the subject of the verb awarded? Who did the awarding? The answer, council, or more specifically, the town council. So council is the subject. Now, is there a direct object? Is there a word that tells us what the town council awarded? Yes, the answer is contract. They awarded the contract, or more specifically, the road maintenance contract. Now, what about an indirect object? Is there a word or phrase that answers the question to whom or to what the road maintenance contract was awarded? Well, the answer in a way is yes, the contract was awarded to a company owned by several local citizens. But this is not being used as an indirect object. Remember, an indirect object would have to be placed between the verb and the direct object. And that's not where the company is placed. The company instead is tacked on at the end of the sentence. Furthermore, notice that the company is mentioned in a prepositional phrase. And as we saw a moment ago, an indirect object is never part of a prepositional phrase. So in this case, company is not an indirect object. Instead, it's part of the prepositional phrase to a company, and therefore it is not, grammatically speaking, an indirect object, even though it answers the same question and conveys much the same meaning. From a grammatical standpoint, it's not an indirect object. Let's look at our next example. Every evening, Richard and Emily cooked us a wonderful meal using fresh ingredients from the local farm stands. What's the verb here? The verb is cooked. That describes the action of the sentence. Who or what did the cooking? Richard and Emily. They're the subject of the verb cooked, and it's, of course, a compound subject because there are two nouns there linked by the coordinating conjunction and. So Richard and Emily cooked. Now, what did they cook? That is, what's the direct object of the verb? What they cooked is a wonderful meal. So the noun meal is the direct object. Now, is there an indirect object, a word that appears between the verb and the direct object, which answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom? Yes, the answer is us. The pronoun us answers the question for whom the wonderful meal was cooked. Lucky us. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object. It answers the question for whom the meal was cooked, and it appears between the verb and the direct object. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object in this sentence. Next example. Each candidate prepared a written statement for the selection committee. What's the verb here? The verb is prepared. Who or what did the preparing? Each candidate. So the verb is prepared. What's the direct object? That is, do we know who or what the candidates prepared? Well, they prepared a written statement. So the noun statement is the direct object. Is there an indirect object, a word appearing between the verb and the direct object, which tells to whom or for whom the statement was prepared? The answer is no. There is no indirect object here. Once again, as in a previous example, we have an answer to the question for whom the statement was prepared, but it appears in the form of a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, rather than as a true indirect object. So the selection committee is the object of the preposition for, and that's simply a prepositional phrase that gives more information about the action. It really doesn't serve grammatically as an indirect object. So this sentence is another example of one that doesn't contain an indirect object. Our last example. 2 minutes before game time, the coach gave her players a final reminder about the crucial importance of teamwork. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is gave. Who or what gave? The coach gave. So coach is the subject of the verb gave. Now, who or what did the coach give? What is the direct object of the verb gave? Well, what the coach gave was a reminder, specifically a final reminder. So reminder is the direct object of the verb gave. Now, does the sentence contain an indirect object, a word that tells us to whom or for whom that reminder was given? Yes, the answer is her players. So the noun players, which does appear between the verb and the direct object, is the indirect object in this sentence. It answers the question to whom the coach gave the reminder, and it appears in the proper location in the sentence, and therefore players is the indirect object in this sentence. Now, so far, we've looked at direct objects and indirect objects, and both of these are used in sentences that contain transitive verbs. Sentences that contain intransitive verbs don't have objects of any kind. The action of the sentence basically stops with the subject and the verb. Of course, modifying words and phrases may be added, but none of those constitutes an object of the action. Now, what about the third type of verb, that is the linking verb? Well, linking verbs are used with a different type of sentence complement known as subject complements. A subject complement is a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective that follows a linking verb and refers to, describes, or modifies the subject. Remember earlier in this program when we talked about how linking verbs work, we pointed out that linking verbs always connect the subject to something that follows the linking verb and which is being equated to the subject. We're being told that the subject is what follows the linking verb. Well, what follows the linking verb is a subject complement, and it will be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. Of course, other modifying words and phrases may be added, but when you're looking for the subject complement, you want to look for a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective following the linking verb, which is in some way being equated to or linked to the subject. Here are some examples. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. Was is the verb in this sentence, and it's a linking verb. As we've said many times, the most common linking verb is the verb to be, and was is a form of the verb to be. The subject of was is Virginia Woolf, a particular woman's name. So Virginia Woolf was, and what follows is the subject complement. The noun novelist describes or modifies the subject Virginia Woolf. It gives us more information about Virginia Woolf. It tells us what Virginia Woolf was, specifically a novelist. So was, the linking verb, is linking Virginia Woolf and novelist and telling us that the two things were equated to one another. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. The two things are one and the same. So this is a classic example of a linking verb being used to connect the subject to a noun, novelist, which is the subject complement. Here's a different example. The world's greatest bullfighter is he. What's the verb here? The verb is. It's another form of the common linking verb to be. What's the subject of the verb is? The subject is bullfighter. That's the noun, which is the subject of the verb, and the other words there give more information about bullfighter. Which specific bullfighter? The world's greatest bullfighter. Now, what follows the linking verb is the subject complement. We said that a subject complement may be a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective. Here's an example of a pronoun being used as the subject complement. He. This is a rather unusual kind of subject complement. You probably don't hear a lot of sentences like this. And indeed, pronouns are the most unusual kind of subject complement. But we thought we ought to give you this sentence because we've made the point that a subject complement may be a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. So here's an example using a pronoun, he, as the subject complement. Notice that the pronoun he rather than him is correct. We have a separate program in this series which talks all about using pronouns correctly. And we'll talk about pronoun case in that program. And pronoun case is what differentiates he from him. When a pronoun is being used as a subject complement, you would use what's called the nominative case, which is he rather than him. And that's technically why he is correct. This kind of sentence doesn't come up very often. Perhaps the most common situation in which the use of a pronoun as a subject complement comes up would be when you knock on someone's door and they say, "Who's there?" and you respond, "It is I." That would be a common use of the pronoun I as a subject complement. And because it's a subject complement, you want to use the nominative case I rather than me. So "it is I" is correct rather than "it is me." It's a small matter, doesn't come up a lot, but we've covered it now, and we're ready to move on to our third example of a subject complement. Sandra looked happy. Here, the verb is looked. The subject is Sandra, and looked in this case is being used as a linking verb, because what follows isn't receiving the action of the verb, but rather it's equating or being equated to the subject. What follows is the adjective happy, which describes, modifies, refers to, or gives more information about the subject. We're being told that Sandra was happy. So Sandra and happy are being equated to one another. We're being told those two things are one and the same, Sandra and happy. So looked is acting here as a linking verb, and what follows is an adjective being used as the subject complement. So once again, a subject complement follows a linking verb, and it can be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. And just like the other forms of sentence complements that we've looked at in this program, a subject complement may be compound. In other words, there may be more than one word included in the subject complement, and the two or more words would normally be joined by a coordinating conjunction. For example, Gary is a singer and a dancer. Here we have the linking verb is linking the subject Gary to two words which are nouns, which are the subject complements, singer, dancer. One more example. My favorite sports teams are the Denver Nuggets and the Colorado Rockies. Here the linking verb is are. Teams is the subject, more specifically, my favorite sports teams, and there are two nouns that serve as subject complements, Denver Nuggets and Colorado Rockies. Another example of how the subject complement can be compound. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In some of these sentences, but not all, there's a subject complement. Let's look at each one and see if we can locate the subject complement. First, the original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team was the Colt 45s. First, look for the verb. The verb is was, and it is a linking verb, and that means we can probably expect to find a subject complement here. What's the subject of the linking verb was? The answer is nickname. We're being told in this sentence what the nickname was. Specifically, which nickname? The original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team. But the noun nickname is the subject. And what's the subject complement? Where are we told what that nickname was? The answer is the Colt 45s. That's a noun that's being linked with nickname, and the two things are being equated. The nickname was Colt 45s. So Colt 45s is the answer. That's the subject complement in this sentence. Next example. Many investors use mutual funds as a way of buying shares in a wide range of companies. The verb here is use. Now, is use a verb of action or a verb of being? Well, the answer is it's a verb of action. It tells us something that the subject, investors, do, rather than something that they are. So use is not a linking verb. In fact, it's a transitive verb, and therefore will not be followed by a subject complement. What follows the transitive verb use is mutual funds, which is the direct object of the verb use. So this particular sentence doesn't contain a subject complement. Remember, only a linking verb will be followed by a subject complement. Next, after being reupholstered, the wing chair looked new. What's the verb here? The verb is looked. The subject is chair or wing chair. So the chair looked something. What did it look? It looked new. New is an adjective which describes or modifies or gives more information about the wing chair. So knew, that adjective, is a subject complement. Looked is being used here as a linking verb. We're being told, in effect, what the wing chair was. It was new. The linking verb looked is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And so what follows, the adjective new, is being used as a subject complement. Next, Ronald Reagan became the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. What's the verb here? The verb is became, and the subject is Ronald Reagan. So we're being told in this sentence what Ronald Reagan became. Now, became in this sentence is, again, being used as a linking verb. What follows it is what Ronald Reagan was. Once again, the linking verb, even though it's not, in this case, a form of the verb to be, is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And what was Ronald Reagan? Well, he was the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. The noun person is the subject complement in this particular sentence, and all the other words that follow the verb there serve to give more information about exactly what kind of person, the oldest person, and so on. So in this particular sentence, the linking verb is became, and the subject complement is the noun person. Our final example. The hikers were exhausted and ravenous after their trek up Mount Washington. What's the verb in this sentence? Well, the verb is were, and were, of course, is a form of the verb to be, which is the most common and important of the linking verbs. The subject of the verb were is hikers, and what follows the verb were is what the hikers were. Therefore, it's the subject complement that gives us more information about the hikers. And the hikers were two things. They were exhausted and ravenous. Those are both adjectives which give more information about the hikers. So in this case, we have a compound subject complement. Two adjectives joined by the coordinating conjunction and both of those words go to give us more information about the subject of the linking verb were. Let's quickly review. In this program, we've talked about three kinds of sentence complements: direct objects, indirect objects, and subject complements. Remember that direct objects and indirect objects are used only with transitive verbs, while subject complements are used only with linking verbs. Now let's step back for just a moment. We've seen now how complete sentences are constructed. There's a verb in the middle, a subject usually appearing before the verb, and then very often a sentence complement of some kind that comes after the verb. You might almost think of a sentence as a lever or a teeter-totter, something like a seesaw, with the verb as being the fulcrum, the balancing point in the middle. The subject usually comes before that, and the sentence complement, if there is one, comes after that. You now have the complete structure of what most typical English sentences look like. And all the other words and phrases that may be added onto the sentence serve to give more information about or to modify the subject or the verb or the sentence complement. So if you understand how these three major parts of a sentence work together and how different parts of speech can be used to modify or give more information about them, you'll understand how virtually every English sentence is constructed. And that will make it much easier for you to create your own English sentences that are both grammatically correct and express your ideas clearly. I hope you found this program useful. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on other programs in this series.